Hello. Welcome to the Tea with Jamie podcast. It is Wednesday, May 20th, and we are 2 days away from the start of the weekend in Canada. Very exciting. It was another 3-week break that we had to endure. And we're now back properly into the season this time. A couple of false starts, but we're properly into a regular season. We may even get an extra race. I mean, who knows what's actually going to happen with the 8 races towards the end of the year in the Middle East, but we might get an extra one, we might lose a couple, who knows? But this, I think, from this point on is at least more normal of a season. We do have the summer break, that's another break we've got coming up, but we're used to breaks now. Anyway, today is normal service returned for the pod. Thank you to Christina for joining me yesterday. If you are going to Canada this weekend and you didn't listen to yesterday's episode, I would recommend it, particularly if you're new to that race. She had some really great tips and tricks for how to survive that weekend, how to get the most out of it, what you need to bring to the track, suggestions of all stripe. So thanks to her for joining the pod. But today we are doing what I often do, blind reading the news, reacting to the news in real time. I haven't done any prep for this episode. Got a busy day coming up today, so it is currently 7:09 a.m. I've got a thing I need to do at 8, so I've got to get moving. All right, here we go. Let's see what we encounter. All right, first things first, let's go to Racing News 365. Okay, now this we can talk about. McLaren confirms huge upgrade package for Canadian Grand Prix as Mercedes fight looms. Now, before I get into it, let's see who wrote this. Doesn't say. McLaren, if you remember, brought a pretty decent upgrade in Miami and now are confirming a huge upgrade package for Canada. And McLaren are turning out to be a bit of a dark horse this season, right? Now, it's weird to say that as a double constructors winner, but they weren't really talked about much after the first few races because they weren't in the first few races barely, or at least the first 2. So they've kind of snuck up on everyone. Mercedes stole a march on the rest of the grid, right, by just dominating, and have continued to dominate even with a resurgent McLaren. But they have been chipping away at this Mercedes lead. And this race weekend coming up is the weekend that Mercedes bring a huge upgrade. So what happens this weekend is going to be very telling for the next few races, I think. Now, not only have the teams just come off another break, which has given them time to develop and produce the parts and get the upgrades lined up, ready to go, but also the race after this one is Monaco. And yeah, teams do bring upgrades to Monaco, but it's super hard to evaluate how effective they are at such an odd, slow track. It's very not typical for the race calendar. Even with more street tracks on the calendar these days, Monaco is a sort of unique beast, right? As we all know. So anyway, let's get back to the article. All right, there's a quote here and I'm not sure who it's by. So I'm just going to read the quote. As established at the beginning of the season, Miami served as the first big step in our plan to add performance to the MCL 40, the team said ahead of the weekend in Canada. All right, so this quote is by, quote-unquote, the team. This continues this weekend in Montreal with a number of new components across the floor, chassis, front and rear wings, bodywork, halo, and roll hoop. And this is back to the article. The most compelling single update is the rear wing, which is believed to be McLaren's take on the Macarena wing concept. Okay, so McLaren are bringing a flippy, spinny rear wing like the Ferrari and the Red Bull that Red Bull introduced in Miami. And yeah, so as I said previously, they really proved in Miami that McLaren are there or thereabouts, as a championship winning team. Double sprint win, double podium in the Grand Prix. I mean, that's pretty indicative of a performant car, right? And a performant team. Now, what's going to happen when the Mercedes introduce their upgrade? And what are all these upgrades going to mean for McLaren? Like I said it before, it is a little dangerous bringing all your upgrades over one weekend, as Mercedes are doing. if they have any issues whatsoever, trying to diagnose what those problems are, is that whole process is made much harder when so much is new. It's sort of the anti-scientific method, right? Change one thing at a time, reassess. So McLaren have done the sensible thing of splitting it up over the course of 2 weekends. And, Ferrari brought a bunch of updates in Miami, and, I'm sure they're going to bring stuff too in Montreal. So where the pecking order shakes out at the end of the weekend is going to be very interesting. Now, there may be random elements. There's weather. The weather is an unknown, right? So it's not necessarily the race result that is going to determine where are the teams on the pecking order, right? It's what is the performance over the weekend, across all the sessions. Now, again, sprint weekend, so it's, again, a little harder to tell, but it's quite handy to have 2 qualifyings, right, for out-and-out pace to really solidify, okay, who's really got it. 6 sessions of qualifying, essentially, to really determine what the actual out-and-out pace is, and then race pace is another discussion. All right, so that's it, really. Basically, McLaren are bringing a big update across a lot of aero parts of their car, and the rear wing is going to start spinning. Okay, so this is a real quick one. This is an article by Jake Nickel on Racing News 365. This is something I alluded to a few episodes back when they brought in those new rules for Miami, and one of them was this MGUK kick-in at the start, which wasn't actually a rule that was enacted at Miami. It is now being brought in. I believe it's being brought in from Montreal onwards. And I said at the time that Ferrari were going to be hopping mad about it. And as predicted, Fred Vasseur is hopping mad. He thinks it is very, very unfair. So just a very quick quote from Vasseur. He said, "You can put on the table the safety grounds, and it's the right of the FIA, and I have just to accept. But at the end, I think it's also a bit unfair on us. I went to the FIA 1 year ago and we spoke about this. We spoke about this in SAC, and we spoke about this in the PUAC. I really appreciated the answer from the FIA that you have to design the car for the regulations, not the regulations for your car. I think this is a very good approach. So then to have half of the grid, 40% of the grid complaining that it's mega dangerous and so on, politically it was well played, but not very fair." All right, there's more to that article, there's more to that quote, so definitely check it out. But he's basically saying, yeah, we designed our car knowing this was going to be the case, as all the other teams knew it was going to be the case. Just to remind you, the MGUK kicks in if the car gets a really poor start, if the revs are not high enough, if the turbo's not spun up. So it gets the car off the line for safety reasons. Now, as he said, they knew with these power units this was going to be a big issue. So they went with the smaller turbo that spins up nice and quickly and is much more reactive. And the other teams were like, no, the FIA is just going to have to deal. We're going to have a safety issue, so they're going to have to allow us to have a bigger turbo and figure out a way to deal with that because it's too dangerous not to. It was a game of chicken, and so far in the season, Ferrari have won it with their incredible starts. They've definitely had a huge advantage there, even if their race pace or up to speed pace was a little lower because of that diminished turbo. But this game of chicken from the other teams has really paid off because now there is no danger essentially of stalling or not getting off the line straight away. Now, I don't think this gives the slower cars off the line any kind of advantage off the line because there must have to be some kind of delay in the system. Now, I know the compute power is enough that it can react within a millisecond, which is fine, but I think they need to have, and I hope they have, put a buffer in there so that it doesn't advantage the cars that have a bad start, that get inadvertently a super start now because the computer kicks in and just fires it off the line. If that is the case and we see that, that is terrible. That is truly awful. Now, I believe they could just very simply adjust that for the future and then put a little buffer in place because, of course, no one's going to have an immediate crash off the line because they're stepped, right? All the places are stepped. So, it would take a while for the car behind, or take a certain amount of time for the car behind to get to the point where the car in front has stalled. So it doesn't have to kick in, within milliseconds But if it kicked in after, say, 5 milliseconds or 15 milliseconds, it would still be essentially a poor start, but it wouldn't be just this lump sat on the grid doing nothing. Anyway, that was a little bit of corroboration from speculation that I had back at the time. Okay, let's move on to Formula1.com. Let's look at the weather report. This is from 2 hours ago as I record this. Right, so let's see. Okay, this is relevant. So it says here, with some outfits planning to introduce further upgrades, the sole hour of free practice will be crucial to determine their impact. So it's good news that the weather forecast is to be cool and dry on Friday. Okay, so that's not just FP1, it's also SQ, sprint qualifying. So we should get a good qualifying. The pleasant conditions should continue into Saturday's sprint and qualifying action, but Canada's typically changeable weather could rear its head on Sunday, with rain and wind predicted to add another challenge to proceedings. Okay, so this is interesting. This is another tick in the box of a sprint weekend, right? Because we're going to have potentially different weather conditions for the sprint and the race, which should give us two very different experiences, the sprint to the Grand Prix itself. So Saturday should be okay, same as Friday. So that's also handy that we've got two clear qualifyings for us if we're to just determine what the pecking order is. That's quite handy to have that. And then the sprint race should be dry too. So again, we'll get a little bit of a sense of race pace. Of course, they're not fueled up for a whole Grand Prix. There aren't really pit stops unless there's, damage. So strategy is not such a thing. Race pace over a long extended period is not really a thing. Then we're not going to have a quote unquote standard race if it's going to be interrupted with rain. Because of course, we're not going to see all these upgrades, how they perform over a longer period with multiple stints. Now, there will be multiple stints. It will be the full race, of course, unless it gets red flagged and cancelled completely. But it will be at a much slower rate, and there will be no fuel saving and all this kind of, they're not pushing the car to the max. They're just trying to keep it on the track. Really impossible to tell how those upgrades are going to work in race conditions if it is a wet race. However, they're going to learn how the upgrades work in wet race conditions. So that is learning of some kind, right? And overall, they're going to figure out how these cars work in the wet. Now, from memory, I think the Racing Bulls did a shakedown in, I think it was Monza, and I believe it was a bit wet there. So I think they have a bit of a sense of what it's like. And I think Lewis did a Pirelli test in wet weather conditions. And so I think he has a sense of what's the deal with these cars. Now, remember, with these like 50% almost electrified engines, you just have instant power, instant speed under your right foot. There's no lag. Like you see that with road cars, right? All electric vehicles they jump off the line. And that's not really what you need or want in the wet, of course. You want a little play there. So it's just so easy to lose traction. The moment those tyres lose traction, they're not draining away the water, they're skidding along on top of it, and then they're off. They're just off. And with a lot of close walls in Canada, that's just almost immediate retirement. So they're probably going to be driving around in a higher gear than they need at any one time, even more so than in usual wet conditions, to compensate for that. I don't know how much control they have over turning down the electrical side of their power unit, at will with something like this. I'm pretty sure they're pretty locked into that. They're definitely not going to be boosting. And I think with the aero modes, I think one end stops working. I can't remember if it's the front wing or the rear wing that stops flipping backwards and forwards with aero mode. Do you know what? Let me just Google it. Okay, so in wet weather, the front wing flattens on straights and then increases its angle for the corners, but the rear wing stays in the high downforce setting the entire time. If it is an extreme downpour, they can simply turn the entire active aero system off. So it stays in corner mode the entire time, the most downforce possible. Now, of course, the more downforce, the better in the wet, right? You want more traction, as much traction as possible. So, yeah, that's how it is. So it depends on how wet it is. First stage is fix the rear wing to high downforce mode at all times. Second stage is just make the whole car stay in high downforce mode when it's a super downpour. So yeah, that's the weather forecast. All right, we move on. Okay, another article on F1.com. This is a little speculation. Let's do some speculation for a change. David Coulthard reveals why he thinks Verstappen will not be going anywhere as he backs Red Bull stay. Okay, so let's remember David Coulthard, original Red Bull racing driver. I don't know if he still does a lot of promo for the Red Bull team. I feel like I see that he does, but he's worked with Red Bull for many, many years. So he, you could argue, has great inside knowledge on this, but maybe a little bit swayed toward what's good for the team. I don't know. I'm speculating about the speculation here. We just got to be open about what the situation is here. This is David Coulthard's quote on the Up to Speed podcast. Max will not be going anywhere because there's no other Formula One team that would allow him to be Max. McLaren wouldn't be able to do it. Ferrari wouldn't be able to do it. Mercedes wouldn't be able to do it, despite the fact he was driving at Mercedes just because of the investment that goes into the individual car, but Red Bull do. All right, I'm going to slightly butcher this quote because it, word for word, is a bit of word salad. So I'm going to slightly compress it a little bit. All the same words, just with some words taken out. And actually, in fairness and in the spirit of Mr. Mateschitz, the founder of Red Bull, when I first met him signing for the team, I asked him, "What do you expect of me?" And he said, "Be yourself." Max is being himself. Okay. So it's a good point, of course. David Coulthard knows the sport far better than most people. Yeah, of course, they have that, right? They have a culture of being yourself. The whole team culture really suits that. And the team itself really embraces doing things a little differently, being a bit quirky, being kind of extreme, doing a lot of high-profile PR, attention-grabbing stunts. And, Max is sort of perfect for that. He is the biggest name in Formula One at this point in time. And he brings with him a huge amount of PR. And so why wouldn't they let Max be himself? Now, yeah, you can say that is very valuable. Do you get the impression that Max being himself is Max's motivation? Or do you think winning races and championships is Max's motivation? I think when he gets behind the wheel of a car, all he thinks about is getting to the front and leading. I think when the visor comes down, that's all he cares about. If I'm going to armchair psychologize this. It's not particularly deep, right? He even says it himself. His driving style is very apparent. That is the case. So, honestly, I think any team, with the exception of McLaren, and I've gone on record as saying this, I don't think he's particularly appealing to McLaren for a bunch of reasons, and I'm not going to get back into it now. But I think a Mercedes will be very accommodating to a person like Max. And whether he writes that into the contract or it's an unwritten rule that, look, if I'm going to drive for this team and I'm going to stay at this team, I have to have a certain level of autonomy and power to make decisions and live my own life, then they will, I should imagine, accept that. Will that end well at a huge organization like a Mercedes-Benz? I don't know. But I think on two fronts, if the Mercedes by the summer break is still head and shoulders above everyone else in this regulation set, and particularly after this weekend's upgrades, where is this Mercedes going to be, as we talked about a lot earlier? If after this weekend, and then for the next few races right up until the summer, the Mercedes is still dominating, I don't think a little bit of autonomy that Max could negotiate at another team is enough to stay at Red Bull. Now, on the one hand, people are like, Max is done, he's bored of this sport, blah, 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 he's just going to leave, which is a fair argument, could well do. why wouldn't moving to a new team, and not only just a new team, but a new team that are clearly head and shoulders above everyone else, why isn't that seen as an exciting challenge and a change? Why would someone who was bored carry on doing the same old, same old? I mean, he leaves, that's throwing up everything into the air, right, and starting anew, doing something else. But also moving to another team is a different kind of throwing things up in the air and changing. Now, unless Red Bull turn it around so much that they are straight up, not just quali, but race pace, up there with everyone else, and he can drag this team to the front of the grid again, I'm not so sure. What is the point in him he can go anywhere? And it would be, all I'm doing is putting myself in his shoes, which is impossible to imagine. Who can imagine being him, of course? But why would just do the same old thing over and over again? I don't see it. Sorry, David. I disagree. He may well be there next year. But the fact that he's driving a Mercedes in GT racing, endurance racing, and the fact that he's had so many discussions with Toto Wolff over the years, it seems like an inevitability at some point. And the fact that he seems very frustrated and bored, and, he may very well just leave the sport for a few years and come back when we're back to V8s. when we're back to V8s. But just staying where he is, just more of the same. I don't see where the motivation is there, where the excitement is there, where the challenge is there, if I'm being completely honest. So yeah, that's an article on Formula1.com. He goes into his reasoning. I just skimmed the surface there. Basically, I just skimmed the first paragraph. So I'm sure Mr. Coulthard makes a lot of valid points, and it completely decimates my take on it. Can we get Mr. Coulthard some kind of honour? He's been in the sport since the first half of the 90s, and he is a real advocate for Formula One, and he's seemingly everywhere. Channel 4, Formula One commentary, podcasting, going around the world promoting F1. F1 is a huge industry for the UK. I feel like he needs to be honoured, if he hasn't been already. Maybe he has, but I've never heard about it. Anyway, this is a real babbler. Like I say, I've got a busy day today, so this was completely off the cuff, if you couldn't already tell. So I think that is all I have time to talk about today. So I will be back again tomorrow, press day in Canada. I record these in the morning, so it won't have kicked off by then because I'm in the same time zone as the race. So yes, we'll see what news comes out tomorrow. Hopefully some more information about the Mercedes upgrade package for this weekend. Oh, and one last thing. I'd like to thank Aidan for the fantastic comment that he left on Apple. Thank you so much, Aidan, for the very kind comment about the pod. And if you would like to help the pod out, please rate it well and leave a comment. I would really appreciate it. That would help the pod out enormously. Thanks very much. Bye-bye for now. I've been your host, Jamie Muffett. You can find me on social media for more of this rambling nonsense under my name or F1_Jamie. This is an RPS audio production.